Welcome to Conservation Conversations, the podcast where we discuss emerging technologies, global trends, and the future of biodiversity conservation with some of the world's leading experts. I'm your host, Sean O'Brien, President and CEO of NatureServe, where we've been working for 50 years to protect endangered species and ecosystems. With this podcast, we want to introduce our audience to some of today's key players in conservation and share the amazing work being done around the globe to protect our planet's rich biodiversity. Welcome to Conservation Conversations with Sean O'Brien. We're here today with Dr. Saharah Moon Chapotin, Executive Director of the United States Botanic Garden. She's a plant scientist with a passion to educate people about the importance of plants and the Earth's ecosystems, as well as urban agriculture, which I find fascinating. And we did a show recently where we talked a lot about that with Annie Novak. Prior to joining the Botanic Gardens, Dr. Chapotin worked for USAID, the Agency for International Development, and was Deputy Assistant to the Administrator in the Bureau of Food Security there, which is also part of what we're going to be talking about later, I think, with our crop-wild relative questions. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Stanford and a doctorate in plant physiology from Harvard. And in addition to those fantastic credentials, is just a really nice person. So we're really thrilled to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's really great to be here.
And I'm especially thrilled because I can't quite see the Botanic Garden from the window of my office, but it is one of my favorite places in Washington. I have been visiting the garden as often as I possibly can, especially if I ever happen to be anywhere near the US Capitol and I have a few minutes. I just go in and absorb the smells and all of the pheromones and things coming off of the plants and walk around. And I just find it just like a beautiful and peaceful oasis in Washington. And, I know you get 1 million people a year in a normal year visiting. And I think that's too small of a number.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny you said that because before I started working there, I would have told someone the same thing, that it's my favorite place in Washington. And then the number of people who've told me that since I started there. So I think we really do rank up on a lot of people's favorite places in DC, which is just such an honor to be on that list.
When you're competing against all the Smithsonians and all the other things that are happening in Washington, it's still just a really special place. And of course, it's been around for 200 years. And so I just also think that's really fascinating in a country that's not much older than 200 years. Mm-hmm. That the U.S. Botanic Garden is one of the older institutions that we have here. Is really, I think, really cool.
Yeah, this past year, we actually celebrated our 200th anniversary. And as you can imagine, quite a year to have an anniversary. But I think it really speaks to how important plants have been in the history of our country, that the founding fathers of our nation were focused on establishing a botanic garden right here in the Capitol. And they really wanted to demonstrate to people the importance that plants played in their lives. And a botanic garden was an amazing way to do that. And it remains one to this day, but I think it really speaks to how central plants are to our history as a nation.
Yeah, when you think back, actually, people who listen to this podcast regularly know that I used to work at Montpelier, which is the home of James Madison. And Thomas Jefferson, who is known for keeping great records about his farming activities, actually said that James Madison was the best farmer that he knew. Of course, in both cases, it was the enslaved people who worked for them that were doing all of the work. But you're exactly right. If you go back to the founding, so much of our founding is around plants. And speaking of one of the things that we're going to talk about later, maybe this is just a little preview. The origins of wine in America are really important. Mm-hmm. And it talks a lot about the importance of plants in the early period of our country. And you can see why the founders would have wanted to have a botanic gardens early on in setting up the government. But before we go to that and talk about how NatureServe and the U.S. Botanic Gardens are collaborating, I wanted to talk a little bit about your career path. Again, regular listeners know that one of the things I like to do is give any people who are listening who are considering career paths that might take them into plant conservation or animal conservation work, have the right information to tell their parents when they're going to college, hey, guess what I want to study? I want to study botany. And have their parents go, oh, that's a great idea. We think that's excellent. There's wonderful career opportunities for you and it's important work. So tell me a little bit about how you got interested in this field, and then sort of your path to got to where you are now.
Sure. In some ways it's funny, I've come full circle, and I'm having the career right now that I thought I might have when I was in grad school, even though I went off and did a whole lot of other things in between. And as I was a graduate student, I sort of knew I wasn't going the traditional academic professor at a university research route, but I would sometimes say to people, well, I could see maybe ending up director of a research station or at a botanic garden. But then I didn't end up doing that. As you mentioned, I was at the U.S. Agency for International Development, which was a big departure from what I was doing in grad school, which was studying baobab trees in Madagascar. I love trees. I've always loved being at heights. I actually, way earlier, as I was just getting to adulthood, I used to do some circus arts. And so actually I found that tree climbing and canopy biology was the perfect way for me to mix my love of plants and my love of heights. It was perfect. So I spent a lot of time climbing baobab trees, and it was actually while I was in Madagascar that I decided I wanted to sort of pivot my career towards a more applied topic than academic research. And that was partly because I was seeing around me what was happening to the forests in Madagascar and the way that humans were having an impact on their environment. And I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. and working at USAID on issues of agriculture and really thinking about how we can improve agriculture to lessen the impact on the environment.
I love that you just threw in Circus Arts like it was just, oh yeah, Circus Arts, it's just something I do, which I also love. And back when I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to do some tree climbing in Costa Rica back before zip lines and all were a thing. And it truly is magical to be up there in the canopy and see the forest from a completely different perspective. It's really spectacular. Yeah. And for somebody like you who likes heights, it's even better, I would think.
Oh yeah, it's great. I could spend all day up there.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me a little bit, so you were talking about, you thought this might be a place where you would end up. So I want to hear a little bit about, you said research station. And I think when a casual visitor goes to the Botanic Gardens, they're not necessarily thinking about research. So I'm interested about Botanic Gardens in general and their role, and then what makes the U.S. Botanic Garden just sort of different or unusual in its particular role in conservation of plants.
Sure. Yeah, well, Botanic Gardens play a tremendous role in plant conservation in particular, and many have large research programs. But I think their specific role in conservation is so critical. You can do in situ conservation when you're conserving plants in their natural environment, and many Botanic Gardens are involved in that, and that's something obviously you work very closely with. And then you can also conserve plants ex situ, so outside of their natural environment, for example, a living collection at a botanic garden or in a seed bank. And that's where I think Botanic Gardens have a tremendous role to play. And Botanic Gardens will specialize in different ways. Some will have plants that are local to their area. Some will have certain taxa. For example, at the U.S. Botanic Garden, we have lots of native plants to North America, but we also have a huge orchid collection. And many of our orchids are rare and endangered. And so we're serving as a repository for those orchids, and we're maintaining them and keeping them alive. And we can share them with other Botanic Gardens, ensure that those plants are always conserved.
I think that's great. And the in situ and ex situ is really interesting and important part of the conversation, because as you said, NatureServe, we focus on where things are on the ground, and site-specific endemics, which is a fancy way of saying something that only exists in one place, are really important in terms of conservation and in terms of what is endangered on the landscape. And so having those representatives of those species in places like Botanic Gardens is really important for the long-term not necessarily viability, but for being able to potentially recover, restore species back to nature in the future.
Yeah.
And so tell me a little bit about some research that's happening at the Botanic Gardens that, again, maybe people wouldn't be thinking that's something that you do there.
Yeah, well, we partner with organizations. We have partnerships with organizations across the country, and in fact, global partnerships aimed at in the large part, in plant conservation. And you mentioned, working on the ground and understanding where plants are. And then I mentioned conserving, protecting those plants. And we're often at the intersection. So one of the things we're doing is supporting conservation assessments of plants in North America to understand which plants are endangered or rare, or where they are, or what their conservation status is, so that Botanic Gardens can step in and do a better job of conserving those, because of course we don't know what needs to be protected or what is what perhaps hasn't yet been brought into Botanic Garden collections or seed banks. So you need that information, and some of our partnerships are aimed at connecting that information.
Right.
We're doing something with the Morton Arboretum in Illinois that is focused on oaks, native oak species here in the United States, understanding where they are, what their conservation status is, and actually collecting them and ensuring that those oaks are in living collections, because you can't put acorns in a seed bank very well, but ensuring that they're in living collections, and that we're understanding everything we can about these rare oak trees.
So this isn't something that I had thought to ask before, but since you mentioned seed banks a couple of times, I know that there are some large seed banks that are being maintained in other countries, and particularly in the far north where it's nice and cold. Does the United States have an active seed bank program? Is the U.S. Botanic Garden involved in that? What is happening with seed banking in this country?
Oh, that's a whole, that could be a whole podcast in itself. No, we don't have one at the U.S. Botanic Garden, but there are many active seed banks here in the United States. There are some that focus on wild plants. U.S. Department of Agriculture has seed banks that focus on crop plants and everything in between. And we're engaged in that world through partnerships, as I was saying, and an area that we've really been thinking about in terms of conserving plants is in the area of crop wild relatives, and making sure that those relatives of the crop plants that we rely on for everything are being conserved in seed banks or gene banks.
Yeah, so the crop wild relative thing is really, really important, and I think is only going to become more important in the future. And that's a subject that's very specifically important and interesting to you and to me, because our organizations are explicitly collaborating on a crop wild relative project with grapes, of all things. And turns out people love grapes. One of the biggest fruit crops in the world. And people don't just eat grapes, but they drink grapes in various forms. So people have a nice attachment to this. So, I think about this project in particular, and reflecting back to what I was saying about the founders, when they tried to bring grapes to the United States to make wine here, they weren't successful doing that. Can you explain what was going on and how they fixed that, and then how that then helped the old world as well?
Yeah, well, you might need to help me out with the first part of the story. I can flip to the old world part.
Okay.
That's the part I know better, which is just that the phylloxera, an insect, was decimating vineyards in Europe in the old world. And it was actually, they tried a lot of different things, but ultimately it was a rootstock from an American species that was resistant to this insect, which had come over from the Americas. And when you're making, vineyards, you actually can graft the above ground part, the scion, onto the rootstock. And so you can get the benefits of that really hardy rootstock. And you can get, of course, the benefits of the perfect variety of grape that gives you just the flavor of wine that you're looking for.
Right.
And so, in fact, they were able to save the European wine industry by grafting those European grapes onto the American rootstock, which was resistant to this phylloxera.
And effectively, the same thing happened originally. Is the plants that were brought from Europe to the United States couldn't grow in our soil. I think they got a fungus. And so they weren't able to successfully grow European grapes over here. And ultimately they figured out that they could graft the European plants onto American root and grow grapes over here. So not only are the American roots in Europe, they're in our country. And the tops of the plants are also from the same place, but just from over there. And so it's actually really quite fascinating to think that, every orchard, or not every orchard, every vineyard that you drive past is made up of grafted plants. It's quite astonishing to think about, and shows the importance of a crop wild relative, right? We could have no grapes growing, or no wine industry in the United States, at least, or potentially in Europe, if we hadn't been able to get to some wild relatives of a crop.
Exactly. And I think there's stories playing out like that across agriculture. And as you noted, we're working together on conservation assessments for wild vitis, wild grape species here in the United States, and the importance of grapes, wild relatives of grapes, to the grape industry. And In fact, a study that was done a few years back, really looking at the global distribution of the wild relatives of crops, found that crop wild relatives are really underrepresented in living collections and in gene banks across the world. 70% of the crop wild relatives they were able to identify were a priority for collection and for bringing into living collections. And botanic gardens are repositories for many of these. And these were, like really common food crops, like a lot of our cereals, bananas, cassava, things that are real food security crops, as you said, for many, many people across the world. And to me, that feels like such a wonderful way to connect the work that botanic gardens can do and the strengths we have, which is such a global priority of ensuring that we have the crops of the future that we're going to need for the world of the future. So the climate is changing, disease and pest pressures are changing, drought and heat tolerance are incredibly important traits. And crop breeders, plant breeders can access those traits through crop wild relatives. And especially given the new technologies we have now, it's so much more feasible to bring those genes and traits over. So to me, it feels like one of those critical junctures where we can kind of our worlds come together, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful. And I think what you just said is some of the most important things that people could hear. As we go into the climate change reality that we're all facing, and we've become increasingly dependent on crops that are genetically bottlenecked on purpose by big agriculture, we may get into situations where we need to find that wild corn or that wild rice or some other crop that we can splice in so that we can maintain a food supply for the humans on the planet.
Yeah.
And,
and that's happening. I think that's something maybe people don't realize, is that crops are continually being bred to adapt to the changing environment. And the crops that we had 50 years ago wouldn't do well today because there's just new diseases and pests out there. And so plant breeders are constantly releasing new varieties, constantly staying one step ahead of the pests and diseases. And so giving them as many tools to work with and the full range of plant diversity to work with is so important, because that has to happen all the time. And they can, develop better plants if they really have access to those materials.
It's also a really important and interesting point, because you don't really think about it when you think about corn or something that you see when you're driving down the road, that it's different from it was 20 years ago and 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I think most of us appreciate the value of, or the taste of heirloom tomatoes and things like that for some of the genetic diversity that we could hopefully see more in our food supply. So we've sort of talked a little around climate change, and it's obviously at NatureServe, where we're thinking about endangered species, and especially the most endangered species, which are often very range limited. Think about the impacts of climate change on these species, not just the crop wild relatives, but anything, any plants. And actually, one of the things I think is fun about NatureServe is that we're taxonomically agnostic, which means we work with plants, we work with insects, we work with mammals and birds and everything in between, including fungus and everything. And so we think about how climate change affects all of those different things. But I think plants are particularly interesting because the range of adaptations that they may have, or the range of challenges they may have in responding to climate change. And I just love to hear you talk about that a little bit, because I think it's hard to sort of even conceive, if we think 50 years ago what the climate was like, in 50 years from now what the climate is going to be like. What impact does that have on the assemblage of species that we see on the landscape every day when we go out just for a walk in the woods?
No, it's such an important topic, and it's not a theoretical question anymore. We can't say what will the potential impact of climate change be. We're seeing the impacts of climate change right now, and we're already seeing species distributions shift, seeing certain plant populations are no longer thriving where they used to thrive due to either the direct impacts of climate change in terms of cooler or warmer climates or more or less rainfall, but also in terms of the pest pressures, the insect pressures that are going to accompany changes in climate. And so, as you noted earlier, we focus on rare plants, but those that are often found at one site, a single site endemic. And those are so vulnerable to climate change, because if that habitat, that environment changes, there's not another one out there that can survive and roll through and perhaps spread. If it's vulnerable and it gets wiped out due to some climate change event, then it's gone forever. And so I think there's really a need for us to understand what plant distributions are and to understand how plants could adapt, as you said, or where they could shift their distribution patterns. And it's those that are in isolated areas, whether it's islands or mountaintops or plants that are geographically limited from moving, that are going to be the first to go, and where there's some special attention required.
I think it's so important. And we, it's easy for people to think about the charismatic megafauna, but really thinking about how plants are going to respond because of their role in sort of maintaining our environment, whether it's ecosystem services or nature's benefits to mankind. So much of that actually comes back to the plants on the environment, that we really can't overstate the significance of thinking about plants when we're thinking about conservation, and not just focusing on the pandas and rhinos. Not that they're not important, but we really have to pay attention to what's going on in the plant world. Speaking to the converted there.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, plants are the foundation of just about every ecosystem on the planet. Most, maybe some in the ocean, but and so yeah, without the plants, you don't have that ecosystem. And as you said, the rhinos and the pandas have got to eat something.
Right, exactly. So Saharah Moon, one of the things that I like to ask people is, at the end of your career, if you're looking back, and that could be at any age that you choose for it to be, what would, if you look back and say, oh, that's the thing that I did that really makes me happiest or most proud. That's why I know I was successful in doing what I do, because you work very deliberately in a mission-driven organization, and that's clearly your path. So you must have some thought about that in your mind, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Is there one thing? I mean, I think it depends where I've been in my career and where I will go. I think there's so many things I would love to have accomplished, but I think for where I am right now, if we can at the U.S. Botanic Garden help grow people's understanding of plants and how plants impact their lives, to me that feels that we'll have done amazing work. And it's both. Yeah, we eat plants, so that's how plants impact our lives. It's how plants are part of the natural environment, and when we're not conserving plants and the ecosystems that they're in, that we're having an impact on that natural environment, which has an impact on us. And plants also sustain us in so many ways. We have beautiful plants in our homes. We enjoy outdoor spaces and gardens. And so I think that, as people come through the Botanic Garden, they walk in the conservatory, they're in our outside gardens, they're in our kitchen garden, or they're attending one of our online programs. My hope is that they'll come away with a greater appreciation for plants and an understanding of how central plants are. And that makes them a plant advocate, maybe makes them someone who recognizes the need for conserving plants and conserving the environment, and allows them to have that perspective as they go through their life. Because they're not going to live at the Botanic Garden, they're going to come through when they come through. But if they can take that away with them, I think that would have been a really important thing.
I think that's great. And you're in a wonderful spot to do that. As we talked about earlier, the U.S. Botanic Gardens, what does it cost to go in? I'm trying to remember. I don't remember taking out my wallet for it.
It's free. It's free.
It's free. It's another one of those great free things you can do in Washington. And so, hopefully we'll be all getting back into places like that again soon, and we'll be able to take advantage of things that you've done there. So I'm actually a little curious, what have you done to respond to the coronavirus, and how have you managed to pursue the mission of the Botanic Gardens through all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it has been an intense year, and I know that's true for you and for everyone out there watching, and that's been true for us at the Botanic Garden. And when we closed to the public, almost a year ago now, I don't think anyone anticipated that we would be close along. And but I'm really proud of my team and of what we did, how we pivoted. We wanted to continue to engage with our visitors and the public, and we found a way to pivot our programming online. And we had some existing programs, and we reached out and we said, hey, can you do this over Zoom or whatever? And we there's a lot of technology involved in trying to figure out how to do that well, and then just really understanding what our visitors would like to be learning about, our participants, I should say, at this point. How can we offer hands-on programs in a virtual space? How can we give people things that they can do to bring plants into their homes, since most people are spending so much time in their homes right now? So that was really exciting, actually. And I think, looking forward, I think there will be continued demand for us to have online programming, even as we're able to come back in person. And so we're, thinking about how we can continue to offer that. And really, it's been a great opportunity for us to connect with a much wider audience than people who can come downtown, say, on an evening or during the week for a program. People who, have live in different areas across the country. We've had people joining our programs from around the world. So it's been really wonderful to be able to connect with so many different people in this new way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think being able to reach out beyond the people who can physically come is so important. And it's great that you've been able to be successful in doing that. And so unless you have any questions for me.
Well, I could flip that question you just asked me. If, at the end of your career, what would be a major achievement for you?
Yeah. So I think there's probably a meta answer and a closer in answer, like you sort of had. My closer in answer is NatureServe, I really believe, is one of the most important organizations that nobody's ever heard of. We are the organization in North America that knows, where the endangered species are, what they are, and has the expertise and the connections to develop plans to conserve them and save them and prevent them from becoming extinct. And so ensuring the long-term viability of NatureServe and our enterprise to provide that service to the world, so that 50 years from now, because NatureServe is about 50 years old, 50 years from now, when I'm well past the end of my career, if this organization is here continuing to protect threatened and endangered species, I will be incredibly proud and satisfied. I do think I reflect back to the answer that Lucas Joppa gave when I asked him this question, and he was willing to say that even if just one fewer species went extinct because of his work, he would feel like that was successful. Because at this point, humans are causing species to go extinct at somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times of the background rate. And we are creating a geologic era that, archaeologists a million years from now will look back and will see an extinction event right now that's as on par with or even bigger than the famous extinction events in the past. And so being able to contribute to perhaps making it harder to find our footprint in the future on the number of species on the planet, it would make me very happy, very satisfied.
Yeah.
Anything
that would be a great legacy. I have no doubt you'll succeed.
Thank you. I hope so. Well, Saharah Moon Chapotin, Executive Director of the U.S. Botanic Gardens, thank you for joining us today on Conservation Conversations. And I really look forward to when we meet in person and can taste the fruits of our labor on the Crop Wild Relative project related to grapes.
Look forward to that too. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you. This has been Conservation Conversations with Sean O'Brien, a production of NatureServe. Thanks for joining us.